Thank you. I was supposed to, and it was written on the program, I was supposed to relate the movement this spring, but I chose to begin with something else, and the situation of the immigrants and the rise of the far right in Europe, which is something which is a burning issue now in France. Maybe you recognize some characters on the slide. There is Marine Le Pen and Matteo Salvini. So Marine Le Pen, maybe you know her name, and Salvini is the new head of the government in Italy. And just above them, you see Emmanuel Macron, so the French president, and greeting the former head of the Bosses Association, the French Bosses Association, kind of leadership of the capitalist class in France. Just on the left, the right bottom corner, you see a demonstration of railroad workers in Paris this spring. On the left, some migrant workers demonstrating, and also the way that the French police treats the migrants. And just up on the left, you see this was the Chemnitz riots in Germany. Maybe you have heard of it. So this is the situation in Europe. Actually, the political situation in Europe has been recently marked by the so-called immigration crisis and the rise of the far right. In Austria, in Italy, in Poland, in Hungary, Bulgaria, far-right parties are in the government. Such parties also recently dominated the elections in Britain, Germany, Sweden, and in France. So here, the map is not very explicit, but you see the different countries I quoted. And so you can say that there are far-right governments here, but also that the far-right made huge scores in the elections in France, in Britain, in Germany, in Sweden. So this is this is the current situation in Europe. Everywhere in Europe, we see an increasing pressure of this far right, and many normal, what I would call the normal bourgeois parties that were in charge during or just after the 2008 crisis collapsed, one after the other, after they saved the capitalist economy by carrying out cuts and attacks which affected the living and working standards of the population. But those who benefited from the worsening of the situation for workers are the far-right demagogues. They turned the social discontent into xenophobic and nationalist feelings, exonerating the capitalists by putting the blame on Europe or on the immigrants. As if immigrants were responsible for the layoffs, from the frozen wages, the deterioration of working conditions. Well, using immigration as a scapegoat to divide the working class is an old trick used by the demagogues to win elections. Curbing immigration was, for example, the core of the program of the new elected far-right Italian government, Salvini, the one I showed. The same happened in Austria. While it was making immigrants responsible for everything, the new elected far-right government passed a reform to increase the working time. But the rise of nationalist and xenophobic ideas is not a matter of stupid people being misled by demagogues like Matteo Salvini in Italy, or Viktor Orban in Hungary, or Marine Le Pen in France. Anti-migration policies were enforced by the governments who pretend to be liberal, but who deliberately chose to promote chauvinism. And I think this is important. When the number of immigrants began to increase in 2014, so you get a map of the various routes taken by immigrants. So when the number of immigrants began to increase in 2014, European capitalists decided to take certain of them. To take, it means that they selected the ones they needed. and to make sure the rest could not come, and also to make sure the rest of those immigrants could not come. The most influential European states, like France and Germany, that chose to reduce immigration by making it impossible or terribly dangerous. In 2016, Germany made an agreement with Turkey to close the Balkan route. See, it's the blue one. From the Middle East to Europe through Turkey and Greece. And last year, the French government made a deal with militias in Libya to discourage African immigrants from coming to Europe. This summer, it's the case of the Aquarius. I'll show it later. It's the case of the Aquarius, which is an NGO rescue boat for immigrants in the Mediterranean Sea that hits the headlines. Because neither the so-called fascist Salvini nor the liberal Macron wanted to allow this ship to land in Italy or in France. Both president or minister wanted to show their determination against immigrants. And from that point of view, France is one of the worst countries in Europe. The police harassed immigrants while a new law makes it almost impossible to get a residence permit. It is Hollande, so this is the Aquarius, and so this is the way the police treats immigrants in France. It is Hollande, the former French president, Macron and Merkel, who turned Europe into a fortress and the Mediterranean Sea into a graveyard. So you see the number of deaths in the Mediterranean Sea this year and the years before. This year, around 800 immigrants died there. France and Italy let it happen on purpose. They believe this strategy of terror could reduce the number of arrivals. And in a way, this terror works, because from 1 million in 2015, only 400,000 immigrants came to Europe in 2016, then 800,000 last year, and around 100,000 this year. Because it has now become almost impossible to come. You see how people are treated, so in France. And of course, when the police does that or that or that, then far-right groups can also organize demonstrations saying, go back home. This is a far-right demonstration in Paris. But when the police behaves like that, it's not difficult for them to, they feel comfortable. This is the jungle of Calais that was dismantled by Hollande's police 2 years ago. So this is a view of Calais. And those are immigrants in Paris. You see how they do live. This is on the streets. This place I go every day. So this is the future. The class struggle knows no border. Workers of Hollande unite. But now this is the situation. The excuse for this criminal policy is that European countries cannot welcome the old world's misery, they say. As if the richest countries in the world weren't rich enough to pay for the reception and the integration of immigrants. Of course, there is money enough for immigrants. The capitalists never had been richer than today. In France, they plan to make 100 billion euros profit this year, only the 40 biggest French companies. What's more, the situation those people try to flee was created by our imperialist states who want to preserve their interests by any means necessary, like in Africa or in the Middle East. So, the only migration crisis we face in Europe is the situation of those people who risk their lives to come. In this context, it is very important not only to show some solidarity with immigrants, but also to explain that immigrants are not a threat for European workers. They are part of the same international working class and therefore must be regarded as future comrades in the class struggle. So that's why workers of Hollande unite. the pressure of the far right is a lethal danger for the working class. But the only way to curb the influence of nationalists and to make the chauvinists shut their mouth is to get the interest of the workers heard. Because on this ground, they have nothing to say and they can't disseminate their poison. Wherever they come, the workers have the same interests, and their division can only serve the exploiters. That's why it's so important nowadays to have an internationalist voice in the working class. So now I will explain what happened this spring. So this is a picture. You will regret 68 on a train. So in France, I will say a word about Macron's attacks against the working class. I said that Macron was not really better than Italian Prime Minister or Minister of the Interior, Matteo Salvini, as far as immigrants are concerned. You remember Macron was elected in May 2017 against the far-right candidate Marine Le Pen. He claimed to be a shield against fascism, and he asserted he would renew French politics. Of course, we had to fear this renewal promoted by a former banker. Macron also worked as Minister of the Economy under the presidency of François Hollande, the Social Democrat president who literally killed his own party by serving the capitalists during his term. To such an extent that the Socialist Party, it's called the Socialist Party, of course it's not socialist, is now fading away. So we had nothing to expect from this, from Macron, this avowed representative of the bosses, whose first action in office was to destroy the labor law in the fall of 2017. In France, labor law is or was defined by general national principles. Working hours, minimum wages or pensions used to be the base on a Code du Travail, a labor code. Hollande and after him Macron, they changed it by allowing the companies to negotiate and therefore to impose lower standards. More recently, maybe you may have noticed that one of Macron's main minister, the Minister of the Interior, he left last week, forcing the president to reshuffle the cabinet, which he did not did today, maybe in a couple of days. You may also have heard that talk about the so-called Benalla case. No. Not really. Okay. That hit the headlines this summer. So Benalla, he was a kind of a bodyguard of Macron, and he was filmed while he was beating up a demonstrator after the protest march on May the 1st. He pretended he wanted to help the police do their job. So we saw what the police job is, okay? But it created a small scandal, and so showed showed to a larger audience what's the role of the police in our society, because people were shocked to see that. This scandal, the arrogance of Macron, his attitude towards the protest of railroad workers and students this spring, and the way the French government treats the migrants, all that affected his reputation and certainly pushed those ministers to resign. But this lack of popularity didn't change the purpose of this government, serving the capitalists by launching a series of attacks against the living and working conditions of the majority of the population. After a new reform of labor laws last year for workers of the private sector, we now have the same kind of attacks in the public sector. And former public companies like the SNCF, so the French National Railroad Company, where the dismantling of labor agreements launched this spring a long strike. Now, the government announces a huge plan of layoffs in the public sector, along with an increase of working time for civil servants. Suppression of the taxes on the wealthy, decrease of welfare payments, large-scale austerity plan, facilitation of layoffs we could say that class struggle continues, but in favor of the bosses. So what's the purpose of all those reforms? Well, the French bourgeoisie doesn't know any crisis. Everything goes very well for the capitalist class. I said that the 40 major French companies recently predicted that they will make 100 billion euros profits this year. They don't lack of competitiveness or they don't suffer from globalization. But they see no response to their attacks. So they try again and again to get back what the workers had won in the last decades by fighting. In big companies, as well as in small firms, the bosses cut costs, freeze the wages, feed the competition between the workers, and they do everything they can to make more profits. So this is the situation we have now. And so if we ask how to defend the interest of the working class, the answer is quite simple. We need more class struggle. We need the workers to fight back against the bosses and the government. But how could it be possible? And what can we do to prepare it as a revolutionary activist? This spring, we've seen a joint movement of the railroad workers and the students against Macron's reform. All together, general strike. It was a slogan in the demonstrations. This mobilization did not win. It was not large enough to force the government to withdraw its plan. It did not turn into the wide counterattack of the working class we need to contend with the bosses' offensive. But the railroad workers have been striking for 3 months, showing the rest of the workers the way to resist. Their struggle was therefore important for the whole working class. From their fight, we can learn some things to make the general strike more than a slogan and to reiterate the general strike of '68 and maybe to go further. So this idea the railroad workers had in mind, '68 and this general strike, and some pictures of '68, you see. This is by Renault in a car factory. And here on an occupied factory, total and unlimited strike. So this is now an old story, not '68. 2018 is already an old story. So I won't relate everything. I just will focus on the railroad workers' strike, underlining what was possible, what was difficult, and what we have tried. So now the response against Macron's attack. This was taken on May the 1st, 2018. So first, in January and February, the climate began to change in the youth and among railroad workers. 2 movements were to begin in the following weeks. So I won't say much about the students, so I can focus on the strike at the SNCF, but I could answer questions later. Actually, what launched the movements of the youth was the strike at the SNCF, the strike which changed the atmosphere. The government passed a bill preparing the privatization of the French National Railway Company. Bosses were planning that for years for 3 reasons. First, they want to invest in some train activities to make money. They don't want to manage the whole network, but they are rather looking for some profitable sectors. The second reason is that the company itself wants to generate a kind of internal competition to lower the working conditions and wages. By creating subsidiaries, the company itself gets rid of the established workers' rights, among which the so-called status of railroad workers. It's a kind of special labor agreement for people working in that branch. The third reason of this reform is a political one. In France, railroad workers are a sort of vanguard of the working class. In 4 years, in the 4 past years, they went 3 times on strike on a national range. So Macron and the bosses, they wanted to break their resistance, thinking that it would demoralize everybody if they were to be defeated. This was the plan. In February, the government made its plan public. It contained a series of unprecedented attacks and was so brutal that many railroad workers were talking about a strike as soon as they discovered it. But they had to wait for long weeks before the green lights of the trade unions. On March the 22nd, the trade unions organized a massive national demonstration of railroad workers only in Paris. Around 15,000 railroad workers marched in the streets. Despite the fact that the CGT, the major trade union of the company, wasn't calling for a strike action, the strike participation was very high, which showed the determination of railroad workers, those ones. But this energy was deliberately wasted by the trade unions, those ones. You see, this is the kind of a bunch of trade union leaders from every trade unions in this sector. So you get the CGT head, and so the CGT leadership and other trade unions leadership, all united against the strikers. The same day in Paris, on March the 22nd, the same day in Paris, another demonstration of civil servants took place. And as surprising as it could seem, they didn't march with railroad workers. There were two demonstrations in the same time, in the same city. Fortunately, the two met. But the trade unions saying that it would have confused and weakened the demands to be together in the streets. It was just the first sign of their strategy. 1 month after the reform had been announced, the trade union leadership displayed the workers a novelty, a strike schedule. The workers were asked to strike 2 days out of 5 from April the 3rd to June the 28th. So you see, those are the striking days. You got the whole schedule. So did the bosses, and so did every company in France. So the pretext was that it could allow the workers to strike during 3 months. But in fact, this strategy is not a real strike, since it cannot anyway but the bosses put the bosses or the government under pressure. It's impossible to put the government under pressure when you strike when you are on strike 2 days out of 5. Of course, it could disturb the traffic. Of course, it could also disturb the delivery of raw material, but it could also create an important loss for the company, because a train that doesn't run doesn't yield money. That's true. But it could not force the government to withdraw its plan. And as a matter of fact, this was not the goal of the trade union's bureaucracy. So you see what a train station looks like when the railroad workers doesn't work. That's nice. Whereas the railroad workers were fighting against this reform and for better working conditions, the bureaucracy of the trade unions was negotiating with the company to save its machinery threatened by a reform of the Workers' Council, so the workers' representation. That's what was at stake for them. They used the combativity of workers to preserve their own interests by showing they were the perfect spokespersons to the government and the management who wanted to discuss with. As representative of the strikers, they wanted to show the company that without them, it could have been worse. And it might have gone out of control. All the trade unions agreed on that. Even the left trade union called Sudrail didn't want to break the union's unity, and the control they had over the strike has been the major problem of this movement. This strike schedule, it squeezed the railroad workers' general assemblies, which is a solid tradition of workers' democracy, particularly in this company. And as a matter of fact, what could be the purpose of such general assemblies if everything is planned in advance by the bureaucracy? So you see a general assembly in a small town in France, it's in Le Mans, I think, in the province. So you had dozens of railroad workers discussing, but the problem is you can discuss, but you cannot decide because everything is already planned. Nevertheless, the strike was strong and full of energy. At its beginning, the participation was one of the highest of the past decades. About 60,000 railroad workers went on strike in early April, paralyzing the traffic, as I showed. Around 15,000 took part to the general assemblies. So, in spite of the strike schedule, the movement held steady. Railroad workers marched several times in the streets with the students and other sectors of the working class, like hospitals. So this is a demonstration. I cannot say which one because we had many. So this is the General Assembly of Students. It's quiet. And this is a demonstration of hospital workers with the Eiffel Tower for tourists. That's nice.
This year.
I took the picture. I was quite proud of it. It was not bad. But week after week, one pair of strike day after the other, the participation declined because of this strategy. And finally, the strike stopped in July. This was the plan of the bureaucracy. They wanted the strike to die step by step. Now, the company counterattacks by cancelling local labor agreements, by repressing former strikers, and by preparing huge downsizing measures. I won't develop the details of the movement at the SNCF or in the universities. There is much to say and to show. Demonstrations, general assemblies, actions like this one of students in train stations. So those are students of several universities with railroad workers. This took place in Saint-Lazare, I think. Another demonstration, and you see this was the banner of a committee we built. Written on that, not improvable, not negotiable, withdrawal of the rail reform. But so to finish with, we'll focus on what we have tried as socialist activists. The main problem of those two movements in the universities and in the strike of the railroad workers is that they remained isolated. Students, they stayed stuck in their universities, and the railroad workers continued to strike intermittently. This prevented the movement to expand. The only solution to take up the challenge was a general strike, or at least the threats of a multi-industry strike to force the government to retreat. Some other small movements started at the post or in some hospitals during this period, because such a conflict, it can alter the atmosphere. But for changing the political situation, the railroaders' strike should have looked like a determining conflict that gives the rest of the working class the opportunity to mobilize on their side too. This was our purpose. It meant giving the workers the leadership of their own movements at the SNCF and proposing a strategy. We have some militants in some train stations in Paris, and they tried to build a coordinating group of the local general assemblies in the train station, in the Parisian train stations. There are 6 big train stations in Paris. So they call this committee the Interstation. It's written for Interstations Assembly. It gathered up to 300 strikers. They met regularly to discuss and to organize the movements on a broader scale, independently from the trade unions, in a way. It wasn't really an alternative leadership to the unions, but it was a step toward a democratic movement representing the interest of the workers themselves. It was the only way to compete with the union's bureaucracy and to go over their strike schedule. So this is an assembly of the Interstation Committee in Paris. Another one. And you see what's written on the banner: let's change the strike schedule to win. So another banner of, those are railroad workers from the train station Gare du Nord, Northern Station, from Saint-Lazare, from Austerlitz. And we are still there. It was a song sung by the railroad workers at the end of the strike, saying we won't give up, even if you Macron and the bosses you don't want to see us anymore demonstrating. We're still there and we will stay. So such a interstation committee, such an assembly, it was also an attempt to extend the strike to other sectors. So we failed because otherwise you would have heard about a general strike in France. But still, it was a step toward that. On which forces can the workers rely on? The answer is simple: their own. Because unions and left parties, Mélenchon, maybe you know him, being the leader of the bigger left party, and by left I don't mean extreme far left. By left I mean social democrat. So unions and left parties, they shared their roles. The unions maintained their control over the strike, while the so-called left was just supporting the strike and proposing electoral perspectives, of course. But such a workers' movement is in itself a political event, and its extension to a general strike is the political perspective we need. So to conclude, and this was the slogan, same Macron, same fight. Railroad workers, students, same Macron, same fight. And this is me, actually. So, but I have not taken the picture. It's a journalist that took the picture. This was my university in Tolbiac, it's called, which was blocked and occupied, first occupied by the students, then occupied by the police, which is also a kind of occupation. So to conclude, this experience took place a few months ago, and it remains in the mind of revolutionary activists, but also of some workers and some young people looking for a solution in order to get rid of this society. The only way to do so is to fight back. But so it means to make a class struggle great again. And I hope we will convince them to join the socialist fight, which means to prepare the future struggles of the working class and to find the means to overcome the obstacles. To do so, we need more socialist militants in the workplaces, and we need to implant revolutionary and I would say internationalist ideas in the working class. So this is our daily activity, and this strike at the SNCF shows how important could be the role of socialist workers in such a situation, and also how far the workers can go as long as they get confident in their own forces and as long as they control their movement. Today in France, we are talking about the next European elections in May 2019. They will have a special importance in the context I described at the beginning: the rise of the far right, the attacks on immigrants and against workers' rights. There is nothing to expect from those elections, but for us, the best thing would be to have the largest campaign possible in the working class to popularize this idea. Workers have to counterattack against their true enemies, who are not the immigrants, but the bosses. This electoral campaign could be an opportunity for revolutionary groups to make ourselves heard on a broader scale, but maybe there will be a workers' movement in the meantime, and I would say the sooner the better. Thank you.
All right, thank you. So we'll take 3 questions at a time, and we'll start right there. That's you. The mic.
So we're the workers that commuted on the trains on a daily basis, like what were their feelings about the strikes that were going on? Were they like sympathetic and like, okay, I don't mind walking to work today, or were they pissed off? Mm-hmm. And you know.
Up front and then behind. That's you're up front.
So you mentioned that the bosses retaliated against the strike, as would be expected. My question for you is there any protections that the law in France offers to striking workers in terms of guaranteeing their jobs when they return back from the strike?
Could you comment on the French foreign policy toward Africa? You know, France is a colonial country, and actually, France has to this day bases in some African countries, and up to in the tenure of François Mitterrand, they at one point had 60,000 French troops until '95. And still they do have a heavy military presence in Africa. And also the French government controls what is called the CFA, one Central African currency, and requires that countries like Chad and Mali, etc., deposit 2/3 of their assets in French accounts. And last but not least, according to one research by, the University of the Witwatersrand in South Africa, it mentions that in the former 20 or so African former colonies of France, France more or less dominates, is the predominant imperialist power, owning assets in mining, other transportations, water resources, etc., etc. Could you comment how your group or the left or the movement is combating these imperialist influences in Africa and elsewhere?
I think I missed the first question. I think we got a question about the first question.
The first question about yes.
The workers. The workers that have the right to train and commute every day.
Oh, what's their
like
feeling?
the atmosphere of the people, like.
How does the riders, working class riders, with their
What was their feeling?
The other one? Okay, this is a very hard to say. We tried to estimate how sympathetic were the other workers were towards the strike, because it's not obvious because when trains are crowded and so Some people can see more disturbance than class struggle. But I would say that at the beginning of the strike, it appeared as a legitimate conflict, I think, to a certain extent, in some milieux. But because of this strike schedule and because of the participation to the strike going down at the SNCF itself, people were saying, but why are they still striking? What does it mean? What's the point of the strike? But at the beginning, it was not really the case. People were paying attention to that, and also because because trains, it's the daily life of many workers. Trains that are late, train accidents, and so the strike had a certain echo, I would say. But it's true that only revolutionary activists said to the other sectors of the working class, they are fighting for you. We should fight all together. So we were very few to say so. But I would say at the beginning there was something, because there was this atmosphere. Okay, maybe it creates some disturbance, but those guys, they are in a power struggle against Macron. And this means something to counterattack. It means something to resist to Macron. So, then the right. Of course, in France you have the right to strike. In the USA, you have the right to work, but, which is not which. And the restrictions are especially there are some restrictions, especially in this sector, because it's a public service. So before you strike, you got to fill a form saying I will strike from that day to that day, and this was the problem of the strike schedule. I didn't want to go into the specifics, but actually the train workers that registered on this strike schedule, they could not decide to join the strike the day after, because it was forbidden. So this was a real problem. Of course, if the strike participation have been really high, you could have said, okay, but your rules, we don't care. But it was still complicated to do so. Very few people did. And actually, the repression the SNCF leads today, it's more about you spoke, you said something bad to your hierarchy, you did that or that during the strike. For example, you did a demonstration in the train station during the strike. This is forbidden. So they are looking for every pretext to fire the strike, the militants of the strike. And about the third question, against imperialism in French imperialism in Africa, well, there have been wars in Africa led by the French government, by the Social Democrat government. François Hollande, he began a new war in Mali, but also in Central Africa. And so every time we organized rallies against that, trying to popularize the idea that the slogan is French troops out of Africa. We met, I would say, a limited echo. Sometimes it was complicated, for example, in 2013, when the war in Mali broke out. it was difficult to discuss with Malian people, Malian immigrants. They are very numerous in France. There is a big Malian community, and they were in favor of the intervention of the French war because they thought it could be useful against terrorism and so. So we tried to discuss, but it was not easy, neither with the Malian community nor with the rest of the population, who remains under the influence of not xenophobic or imperialist ideas, but terrorism and. But still, I have in mind one example of people saying we should better create some jobs here instead of sending troops to Africa. So it means we were not alone, but of course it's difficult to combat the French imperialism, and it would be a problem for the whole working class to oppose his bosses and the companies that make profits in Africa.
So, and then.
Thank you for your talk. I really appreciate coming all the way from France, especially for this. No, but I was wondering if you could say a few words about the General Assemblies. You were mentioning how important it is for workers to decide for themselves what is the correct policy and what needs to be done. And yeah, if you could maybe talk a little bit about where that idea comes from, because I know here we have, people have plenty of examples of, when the trade union bureaucracy says, oh, this is when we go on strike, and this is when you stop. Oh, and we were going back on strike for 2 days, we've seen it in the Bay Area too. So, I was wondering, maybe also you could say in that why it was so important to demoralize the workers for the trade union to say, oh, this is the schedule. So even if you do meet, it won't mean anything.
Right there. No, who's next?
It's kind of building on that question, but also I was wondering if you could speak a bit on, in terms of where your group is connected to different railroad workers or students that actually took part in this movement, how you feel they have transformed politically or their sense of kind of what's possible, and really kind of this idea of needing to rely on their forces and doing that, how you feel people have been transformed through that process.
And then the young man right behind. Yeah.
So among American university students in the kind of general American college student body, there is almost no tradition of solidarity and protest alongside workers' movements. It happens. It's very sparse if it does exist, and it happens online if it shows itself. There are like liberal rights protests, but even these are few and far between. So I was wondering if you could just elaborate a little bit more on how students organize themselves in France and how they kind of how they organize around specifically, workers' politics and these sorts of things.
Okay. I don't know what to begin with. To begin, I will begin with the last question. Actually, the situation, the students' organizations in France are very weak. There used to be consistent students' unions in the past, but nowadays they are very, very weak, and they didn't play any important role in the movement. But the existence of few general assemblies were a sign that normal students were paying attention to what was happening. And again, it's not by chance that the movement in the universities, which was, let's say, latent for weeks, it really began when the strike, on March the 22nd, when the strike began. And I think it's a good example of it raises the question, what can we do as students to support the strike? And this was a debate we had in the General Assemblies. It's not easy to debate with when you get let's say 1,500 people in the same place. But the question was, what can we do? And I think that the best thing to do was to continue or to increase the movements of the students, not only on students' questions, because at the beginning it was the reason why the students began to fight. It was the introduction of a new, or the worsening of the social selection at university, which did not exist in France, or not officially. Now it's official. It means that universities, they select their students. So this was we could say at the beginning it was a question of university and so student business. But I think that the best thing to do, it was to increase the students' movements against the government, and to say, we fight not only because we are students, we fight against Macron, same fight. We are all together, and we want to challenge the boss's authority, and we want to fight back. And it was also a way for us to, and it's the reason why some students were appealed by the railroad workers' general assemblies, because they were saying, okay, but we are fighting too. And they saw that before the students came to train station general assemblies, it's railroad workers that came to students' general assemblies in the universities. And so, for example, the first inter-station assemblies took place at Tolbiac, the university you saw at the end. And that way, through that, students they got aware that something was happening, that class struggle was the only way to fight against Macron and against the selection at university. And so this is an explanation, and I would separate this movement of the students to the workers. I would separate that from the politics of the organizations that do not really exist anymore. So I think it was, of course, it was a political choice. Political choice, for example, we improved saying students, we can't be stuck in our university, we get to demonstrate. The problem is that the students, they didn't really see why they would have demonstrated. They didn't really see why it was important to not only to support, but also to show that there was a movement. So we tried to put it forward, but yes, and I think of course in other countries it's different, but I think it's very important for the future, and also for the future of small revolutionary groups, to have students saying, I won't stay in my university, but I got to do something with the workers. And what could it be? there is much to do in the working class, I think, when we are 20, 25. So that's all. And then about the general assemblies of the railroad workers, it was about maybe this interstation thing. Your question, the coordination, or?
It was a broader question about
Okay.
the necessity of controlling your own struggle, determining for yourself what's necessary.
Yeah, this was the challenge. In a way, we lost because the union's bureaucracy kept the control over the situation. But it was also a debate among the socialist organizations what was possible, because you could say that if the workers they do not challenge the strike schedule, then it means that nothing is possible. Because if they were combative enough, they would get rid of that. I don't find it very convincing, but it's true that it was not enough to say to the workers, we get to get rid of the strike schedule. And it was difficult sometimes to find the right slogan or the right policy, actually the right strategy in the strike, because of course at the beginning we were saying, also in this interstation General Assembly, we were saying we got to to overcome this strike schedule. But 1 month later, it was too late in a way. It was insane to say when the strike participation was beginning to decrease, it was stupid to say we need a real strike. Or it was not stupid to say it, but it was not enough. It was not convincing. And that time, the thing that was convincing, and I think the right slogan the workers had, and what really hit the workers, the railroad workers, was the withdrawal of the plan. And this was their way to express that they rejected the trade union's strategy. That's why they wrote on the banner, withdrawal of the plan, because it was not written on the CGT platform. They never said, we want to withdraw the plan. They never said, we are against the reform. The slogan of the CGT was, we want to defend the company. Of course, not very convincing to go on strike. So that's why the strategy of the workers, of this vanguard of the workers, was that time, let's say end of April, beginning of May, it was to say, we strike against the plan and we won't negotiate with the leadership, with the bosses. And this was, I think, the right thing to put forward, saying, we won't negotiate, there is nothing good in this plan. So those were the part of the problems the workers had during the strike, how to convince people, because if you cannot overcome the schedule, even the General Assembly, what can it, this interstation General Assembly, what can it do, apart being a kind of forum where people discuss, where it was also a place where people were preparing the activity in their own train stations, place where they were saying, okay, this argument, it functioned to convince my colleague to go on strike for the next pair of days, and so. So it was very important for that too. There is another question. Okay. It was about the General Assemblies.
Yeah.
Okay, how it changed the mind of people. Of course, 3-month movement changes many things. We saw students discovering the working class in a way, participating to many actions to do the small. We had we organized 3 small students demonstrations in the in the train stations. It was kind of small demonstrations because we were not able to organize a proper students demonstrations sometimes. So those small things in the train stations were important, and it really convinced a series of young people that this was important, and this was the only way to challenge Macron. And on the other hand, in the train stations, of course, we discover a large number of strikers who really were transformed by the strike and who really participated to it, making it living. People who spent hours to convincing their colleagues, people who lost much money because some of them they were on strike for, let's say, 30, 40 days maybe. So because if you want to, when you want to prepare the strike, if you want to discuss with colleagues to convince them, you can't be on strike only 2 days out of 5. You have to be on strike all the time. So, of course, it costs some energy, some time, some money, and those people they are very important for the strikes to come for the future. It's very important to have in this country a number, and of course it does exist in other companies, but in this one we have a number of young railroad workers with this experience of a long and determined and a hard fight. So
in the back, the two folks next to each other.
Yeah, thanks for coming by. This has been great. I guess I wanted to ask, I'll keep it brief, but generally, do you think 1968 was a success in terms of the struggle for socialism? If so, how would you address the fact that despite roughly a third of the French workers being on strike, student activists at Nanterre University, like Daniel Cohn-Bendit, preferred the spontaneity and emotional catharsis of actionism at the barracks instead of party formation. And this allergy to party formation was obviously in light of the French CP's active suppression of striking workers. But I guess, yeah, I've heard like workers' movement, to create a general strike. And I wondered about the revolutionary potential of 68 that might have been squandered. And this in light of Daniel Cohn-Bendit in 2008 saying that the 1960s New Left won socially and culturally, but lost politically, thank God.
So right next, yeah.
So if, as you suggest, that the Socialist Party in France is essentially just another apologist for austerity and the status quo, what is then the conception of socialism that it's putting forward? And what is the alternative advocated by the revolutionary left in opposition to that?
So right here up front, it's you. Him. Yeah.
Here first. Okay.
No, okay. It was you. You want to give it to him?
Yeah, I guess I'm a socialist fundamentalist. Because I bet you, look, well, let me say, I bet you most of the people in this room don't understand the difference between the French unions and the unions in the United States. And in fact, they probably don't even understand the difference between a craft union and an industrial union. When I was fortunate enough to go into France several times, and I was kind of shocked when I saw the unions there openly affiliated with different political parties. I don't know, I don't see the union here. It used to be a union, FO, you know?
They are weak in this company, so that's why I did not mention them.
Oh, no, I'm not, wasn't a criticism. I'm just saying it's a different scene because generally speaking, when you see a strike in the United States, generally it's called by one union and that's it. That union calls it You know, there's no assembly. You're lucky if you get a strike meeting. All right? So that's one thing you might just take a minute and explain, you know, why you have such a diversity of organizations active during a strike. And, you know, also I think things have changed because when I was there, I remember I went to my hotel room and just turned on the television, you know, je ne parle pas, but I turned on the television. And they're having a debate between the Socialist Party, the Communist Party, and somebody. And I'm looking, I said, well, goddamn, you a long way from home, homeboy. Because this is different. This is a different reality. But today, what I'm starting to see, where I spent my time, a lot of time I get to stay with some, you call them migrants, I call them immigrants, doesn't matter. What we used to call the Red Belt around the city of Paris, you know? And those people, like a lot of people here might not know it, in the small towns outside of Paris, a lot of the mayors were communists. They were elected by the people, and they were communists. It was not unusual to see that. Now that started to change, I guess, after 1991. I don't know, you can tell me because you would know better. But, you know, we don't have that kind of understanding here in the United States because we don't live that kind of reality. But I think, you know, when it started to change, a lady came, you know, and they introduced me to her, and I thought it was really tragic because the immigrants used to support the Communist Party, but something went wrong, and there was the formation of something called the Immigrant Party. Is that still, yeah, you never heard of them, huh? Okay, hey, if you never heard of it, maybe I'm just a madman. But I tell you what, no, they gave, well, both can be true. No, because she gave a presentation at UC Berkeley, and what she said was some of the immigrants was voting for Le Pen. Is that true? Well, please explain.
Okay. All right. That's enough.
I'll begin by I think maybe it's important to explain what the so-called Socialist Party is. It's the French Socialist Party is the ear, say, of the Second International of the Second International Organization, and it was rebuilt or regenerated in the early 70s by Mitterrand, who was really a bourgeois politician, former minister of the justice during the Algerian War. Really, it was really horrible. But this guy, he took control over the Socialist Party at the beginning of the 70s, and then he was elected and he governed twice. He made 2 terms in the 80s. But despite its name, the Socialist Party is not socialist anymore since maybe 1914, I would say, because and of course they had a deep basis in the working class, along with the French Communist Party, the French Stalinian Communist Party, but they lost it in the 80s, and then I would say more recently, because as there were kind of a social democrat organization actually, but a few decades ago they were able to say, we are not like the conservative, we are quite liberal, progressive, and we will defend the interest of the workers just a bit, but in comparison to Sarkozy, it's not. It would be better. So they did it, and there were the, let's say the Socialist Party was the leading group of the what we call the gauche, the left. But what changed is that when they came back into office in 2012 with Hollande, they played their role perfectly. I mean, for 4 years, between 2012 and 2016, nothing happened. Hollande, the president, he did worse than Sarkozy before him. He did actually every reform Sarkozy was not able to do because it would have shocked the trade unions. But Hollande, with his social basis, with his contacts, with his ties with the trade unions, with his popularity among working class people, he was able to do so. And he was the first that began to destroy the labor code. And it's not by chance that in 2016, what happened is the first movement in 4 or 6 years was a movement of workers, rank and file people against the labor law destruction, dismantlement. There were students too, but what's striking is that the so-called Socialist Party really killed itself by serving the bosses, and they did it on purpose. For example, on April 2016, the Prime Minister Manuel Valls, which is really a very right-wing man, we called it the Socialist Le Pen because he was really against immigrants, and so this guy, he decided, despite the pressure of the electoral basis of his own party, he decided to force the parliament to adopt the labor, what we call the labor law. And it means that he was conscious that all of the votership of the Socialist Party was against this law, but he decided to pass it. And that's why we could say that the Socialist Party really killed itself. The day after, they made 6% in the presidential election, the worst result of their whole history. But you could say that it was the perfect candidate for the bosses, this Hollande, because he avoided class conflict for 4 years. Then they bet on another guy, this Macron, new bunker but new style, but is the period in which he was able to, let's say, to contain the anger. It lasted 1 year, no more. And now Macron, what does it mean for young people and for workers? It means police men beating up demonstrants. It means what he does with towards the migrants. So this is for the French politics. And I would say that you mentioned the Red Belt. The Red Belt is a series of workers' cities around Paris. The relationship between the left, what we call the left, and by left I mean the Socialist Party and the French Communist Party, towards immigrants is not so simple, because who were the first to say we have too much immigrants in our town? It was the mayor of Vitry-sur-Seine in 1983, a mayor of this of a city of this red belt, saying no, we can't take more immigrants. So in the 1980s, the French Communist Party had a really xenophobic program saying we can't welcome more immigrants, and so. And all those ideas, it disseminated inside the left. And for example, last month, we had a hard debate in France about immigration, because the leader of the France Insoumise, Mélenchon, the leader of the new left party, he said openly, immigration is a tool of the bosses. Immigration is bad for the working class. he said it. And one of his counselor said, yes, we can welcome some migrants, some immigrants, but the other ones, we have to expel them. So it was clear that those people, they tried the same demagoguery the French Communist Party did 30 years ago, and they try to address voters of the National Front. Because of course there are voters of the National Front that are former immigrants sometimes, but they say there is that the unemployment rate is too high to welcome new workers. And of course, it's false. Of course, the immigrants are not responsible for layoffs and for unemployment. But this is the problem we have, namely, some workers, they think that it would be better if France would restore its own currency, if France would close its border. So this is the problem we have, and this is why it's so important to explain to those people that it wouldn't be anyway a solution. And then there was a question about 68. I would just answer it very, very quick. I think 68, it's both, it's somewhat contradictory, I would say, because it's both the biggest movement in France, the biggest general strike in whole French history, 10 million strikers. But on the other side, it's the best demonstration, I think, that without a party, the workers, they cannot defend their own interest, because it was a bit like 2018 on a broader scale, because that time the French Communist Party decided not only to curb the strike, but to end it. And they did everything in their power to stop the strike and to save, and they did it deliberately to save the French bourgeoisie. So it's a demonstration of the possibility of the workers when they decide to go on strike and when they decide to fight. But on the other hand, it's the demonstration of the deep necessity of a workers' organization ready to defend their own interests.
So, right here, Sarah.
You said a bit already about the Interstation Council, but I was hoping maybe you could say a little bit more in terms of how often it met, how it was organized, what it was doing on a daily basis, what types of decisions it was taking, just to get a sense, just to give us a picture of kind of what was happening with the workers who were involved in the Interstation Council.
Thank you for your talk. I got a couple of friends who are studying in France. I was told, I don't know if that's correct or not, but I was told during the student demonstrations and student activity there were actually racist slogans and whatnot. I was wondering if you could...
We couldn't hear that.
During racist slogans and whatnot during the student demonstrations. I was wondering if you could elaborate on that, and I was also wondering if there was any participation on the side of migrant workers, and how were they received by the so-called native French workers. Thank you.
Right there.
First off, I want to thank you for coming out here and speaking to us. And I also wanted to say that I do organize myself. I've been organizing, fighting for immigrants' rights out here. We're going through a lot of the same things with the far right rising and immigrant communities being attacked. But one problem that I've had is that I've tried to organize rallies and I end up with a bunch of people who are not immigrants who just want to hold signs and take pictures. I want to know if you have any tips to get to where we can empower the immigrant communities to feel safe enough to come out and resist alongside of us.
I will answer first the interstation thing, and then question of the migrants. Well, basically, the interstation began to meet, I think, at the end of March, and it was the initiative of some revolutionary activists, actually, in the Parisian train stations, because we got comrades in 4 train stations, I would say. But at the beginning, the comrades, they just proposed their colleagues to join this committee to discuss and so. But it wasn't really successful, because we had only, or they had only 30, 40, sometimes 50 colleagues coming. But I think, well, they maintained the meeting on a regular basis, like every week or twice a week. And with the time, new people came because they were seeing something was wrong. It was not so easy to, well, what could such an organization, such a General Assembly, what could it do or propose is not obvious, because it's not what we call in France or in French coordination, which means an alternative leadership. There have been, in the glorious past of the Trotskyist movement, in 1986, there has been a strike at the SNCF, exactly 2 weeks after students' movement against the selection. Sometimes a story repeats itself, once as a joke. There has been a strike with a coordination committee of railroad workers. It was in December 1986, and that time this coordination was really a leadership. It means they were challenging the union's strategy, and they put the union's bureaucracy under pressure that so far that to a certain point the workers were able to control the whole strike. They were able to say, oh, we are going to organize this demonstration and so. But to do so, you get to be to build a kind of representative organization, something stronger than just an assembly which discusses. It was not really a Soviet, unfortunately. But the question was how to become a Soviet. It's the question everybody has in mind. And the thing was, how can we associate workers to this thing? And part of the answer was to give arguments to help people being active in their own train station, and and more than that, the simple fact to gather and to see how many train workers opposed this strike schedule and opposed the union's bureaucracy, it was still very important, and it encouraged people to speak in the General Assemblies. I got an example of that. You must imagine that the General Assembly, so workers were striking by a pair of 2 days. The first day, they met and they had such an assembly in every train station. Sometimes the bureaucracy succeeded in scattering the workers in several very small assemblies, but generally it was one assembly on the first day of the striking pair. What happened? you got 50, 60, 17, let's say 100 or more sometimes workers gathered, and the local bureaucrats of the trade unions, they speak. They made a speech. Every union or every unionist, the leadership, says what's his union's position on the strike. So it can last 1 hour, and then what's to be done? Then, once the unions have said strike is good, strike is important, this strike schedule is perfect, what do you want to do? Many workers, they felt uncomfortable, but it was very difficult for them to express it, because because it would have been if they were to contest the bureaucracy, it would have been, I want something else. And that's why the only ones who spoke were either revolutionary activists or members of small strike committees that were created just in order to make the strike living. But the other colleagues, they were not able to confront the bureaucracy. But I got an example in one train station in Paris. We have an example of a woman who participated to let's say the third or the fourth interstation General Assembly, and the day after she came back in her station's assembly. It was in Gare de Lyon train station. She came back, and after the usual speech of the union's bureaucrats, she said, "Okay, but those who wants to go on strike every day, raise your hand." And it was not huge, only maybe 10 or 15 workers raised their hands, but she was able to say to propose that because she saw the day before that she was not alone, that there were also 100, 150, 200 workers, 200 colleagues from other stations who felt the same. So this was the purpose of the General Assembly, of this Interstation General Assembly committee. The problem was how to grow, how to begin more representative, how to begin stronger, and this was very difficult. But it had a huge impact. Then just a word about immigrants. I never heard what you say are racist slogans in the demonstrations.
That's what I heard. I might be wrong.
You read it somewhere, or?
I have friends who study in Paris.
Okay, because I participated to almost to every demonstrations and never heard about that. The only racist in the demonstrations were the police, and they were quite numerous sometimes, but and they are racist, no doubt. It's a difficult question. What can we do with all those immigrants who come? The first thing is that the vast majority is in a very precarious situation, because they sleep on the streets, they got no place to be, they try to ask for asylum, but it's not easy. And there are some NGOs who do good work, I would say, because they help them. And they help them sometimes against the police, because I could explain what's the police doing, using tear gas against migrants, taking their blankets In winter, it's really horrible. So there are those people helping immigrants, but it's really a humanitarian activity. What we could do, and I got an example of, or two examples, is to help them organizing themselves. In Paris, in a university, and in another university in Nantes, in Western France, there have been some small but consistent movements of students to help them occupying a building. The problem was, what's next? Once they occupy this building, what can happen? How can we expand the movement? It's very difficult because those people, of course, they are future workers and they have the same interest, but they are in such a precarious situation that the first thing they want is a roof, document, residence permit, and so. But it's not impossible for them to fight. And the best way they have found for now to fight is to fight as workers. And for example, we had 10 years ago a huge strike of undocumented workers in Paris, which lasted maybe, let's say, 2 years. They striked intermittently, but still they were striking to obtain their document and their residence permit. And it was kind of victory. And we had the same on a smaller scale this spring. Around 100 of undocumented workers went on strike, and they won. It was also in Paris. They occupied some part-time agencies, yeah? And they won. So it shows that they can organize themselves. The problem is what are they ready to do? And the second issue, I think, is how to build a connection between those people and the workers who live here. Because the expansion of xenophobic or chauvinist ideas is really a lethal poison, I think, for the workers. The division is the worst thing we have. It's a thing we really suffer from. And it's, I think, an important activity for the immigrants. It's also very important to explain native or workers who are here why they share the same interests. It's not easy. Really, it's not easy. But if we don't, no one will. And that's why I think it's also the task of revolutionary activists, because if we don't have this basic internationalist propaganda, no one will. And it's not the left, the Communist Party or the Socialist Party or Mélenchon, we will undertake this activity because they don't think that workers have the same interest across the borders. So that's why it's so important for us to convince people that their enemies are not migrants or Europe or I don't know who, China, or but that their enemies are their bosses. And so this is what the work we do. And of course, when immigrants go on strike, when immigrants fight to defend their interest, as part of the working class, they can show the path for the rest. And sometimes the natives are behind, are less conscious than the migrant workers. And so the question is, who will be the first to begin this counterattack? And of course, this counterattack must be general for the whole working class. with documents or without, it's the same. But this is for the future, I hope.
That's a great